One rule operating in one jurisdiction required any product made anywhere in the world to carry a United States export license if more than 0.1% of its content traced back to American technology. That was the reading in May 2020. The reading in 2024 is two jurisdictions running structurally equivalent rules aimed in opposite directions. The gap between those two readings and the mechanism that closed it is what this script measures. One jurisdiction in May 2020, two by 2023 and 2024. That is the count this script follows from the moment the United States deployed an extraterritorial content threshold rule against Chinese chipmakers to the moment China deployed a structurally equivalent instrument aimed outward at the same supply chains. The rule Washington built is called the Foreign Direct Product Rule. In its expanded form, applied to a major Chinese telecommunications company and its affiliates starting in May 2020, it extended United States licensing jurisdiction over any product manufactured anywhere on Earth, provided that product was made using American equipment, American software, or American design above a defined content share. That share was set at 0.1%. The threshold was not chosen for technical precision. It was chosen because no global semiconductor supply chain could be purged of American origin content below that level at industrial scale. The rule was a legal chokehold calibrated to be impossible to engineer around without dismantling and rebuilding an entire generation of fabrication infrastructure. One jurisdiction, one rule. For roughly 3 years, no other sovereign matched it. The enforcement mechanism worked through the Entity List, a registry maintained by the United States Department of Commerce that designates specific companies as requiring a license before any American technology touch product can reach them. Once a company is listed, the extraterritorial reach of the Foreign Direct Product Rule means that a factory in Malaysia, a packaging house in Vietnam, a materials supplier in Japan, all of them face United States licensing requirements for shipments destined to that listed entity. The rule follows the content, not the factory. The documentation of how that rule worked was entirely public. Federal Register notices described the threshold. Enforcement guidance explained which product categories fell under which controls. Compliance advisories published by the Department of Commerce told regulated companies precisely what they owed and why. Those documents were written so that the companies subject to the rule could understand their obligations. They also served in aggregate as a detailed schematic of the instrument's architecture. A combination lock's inner workings appear in its patent filing so that compatible parts can be manufactured. The Foreign Direct Product Rule's inner workings appeared in its regulatory filings so that affected parties could comply. Reading the specification closely enough eventually tells you how to build the lock. Chinese trade lawyers and policy teams had years of documented compliance demands, enforcement cases, and choke point logic to study. The copy required no hidden transfer. It required a legislative decision to use the same instrument. China's Ministry of Commerce and related agencies began publishing extraterritorial controls on exports of certain materials and technology through 2023 and 2024. The structure carries content percentage thresholds. It carries extraterritorial reach provisions. It applies to foreign-made goods that incorporate Chinese origin-controlled content above a defined share of the product's composition, and it requires authorization before those goods can reach designated foreign entities. The structural parallel to the Foreign Direct Product Rule is documented in trade law analysis from organizations including the Center for Strategic and International Studies and working papers from the Peterson Institute, though the precise numeric identity of the threshold across every controlled product category is an analyst reading, not a single published Chinese government statement equating the two figures exactly. The 0.1% twin characterization is a strong structural parallel, confirmed in architecture, not necessarily confirmed clause by clause in every product classification. That caveat belongs on the reading. Two jurisdictions, same architecture, same direction of effect. The rule follows the content, not the geography. The first signal of enforcement credibility came in August 2023, when China announced export restrictions on gallium and germanium, two materials used in compound semiconductor production with explicit extraterritorial framing. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce documented those restrictions. Analyses by the Rhodium Group and the Semiconductor Industry Association noted the extraterritorial structure. A rule that exists on paper is a threat. A rule with enforcement cases attached is a cost. China's gallium and germanium moves functioned as a proof of concept for the broader extraterritorial architecture, demonstrating that the administrative machinery could execute, not merely legislate. Before 2023, China's export control law had no high-profile extraterritorial enforcement action against a foreign semiconductor supplier. By the close of 2023, it had documented enforcement actions and foreign company designations. From a rule with no cross-border enforcement record to a rule with cases. That is the delta in enforcement credibility across roughly 2 years. The enforcement caveat is real and should be stated plainly. Gallium and germanium sit outside the most advanced chip manufacturing steps. Applying the same extraterritorial architecture to advanced packaging or chip-making equipment would require enforcement against much larger and more politically sensitive counterparts than material suppliers. The precedent exists. The extension to higher-value semiconductor supply chain nodes is not yet demonstrated. The compliance risk for foreign companies is real. The enforcement record in chip-making equipment specifically is thin. These readings are structurally sound and enforcement thin, and that distinction matters for any supplier calculating actual exposure rather than legal exposure. The supplier exposure delta is where the mechanism becomes concrete for any company not headquartered in either jurisdiction. Before 2020, no major non-American jurisdiction operated extraterritorial semiconductor content rules. A Dutch lithography maker, a Japanese specialty gas supplier, a South Korean memory producer, none of them faced cross-border content threshold controls from any sovereign other than, in limited circumstances, the United States. By 2024, suppliers across semiconductor equipment, specialty gases, advanced packaging materials, and electronic design automation software face documented compliance obligations in both the American and Chinese frameworks, to varying degrees depending on what they make and which inputs they use. The compliance surface expanded from one sovereign to two sovereigns running partially conflicting demands. The conflicting demands are the mechanism's sharpest edge. Once two large market jurisdictions operate the same extraterritorial rule in opposite directions, a supplier cannot satisfy both by relocating its factory. The rule follows the content, not the geography. That sentence is worth repeating because it defines the trap. Moving a packaging facility from one country to another does not change the content lineage of the inputs going into that facility. The only exits available are full decoupling, meaning one customer base abandoned, or a product architecture redesigned so that no shared content crosses either threshold, which at current integration levels across the global semiconductor supply chain is an engineering project measured in years, not quarters. Effectively, 0 third-country supplier categories faced dual jurisdiction extraterritorial content rules in 2019. Multiple supplier categories faced them in documented form by 2024. That is the delta in supplier exposure across fewer than 5 years. 3 readings emerge on why the metric moved, and they are worth separating because they carry different implications. The first is about calibration. The 0.1% threshold was not a technical measurement of American content in the average semiconductor product. It was a legal architecture designed to be below the practical minimum of American origin content in any competitive chip supply chain. Whoever drafted it understood that the threshold's value was its inescapability at scale. China reproducing that specific calibration logic rather than choosing a different threshold is not generic imitation. It is a forensic reading of what made the original rule effective, followed by a deployment of the same forensic result. The copy targets the same mechanism because the same mechanism is what worked. The second interpretation concerns the supplier's position. When the metric moved from one jurisdiction to 2, no third-country supplier moved with it. The suppliers stayed where they were. The jurisdictions moved around them. A company that had carefully built compliance with United States export controls over years of documented Federal Register guidance suddenly found itself inside a second overlapping jurisdiction without changing a single product specification. The compliance cost doubled. The supplier did nothing differently. That is a structural shift, not a policy adjustment, and it affects the calculation of every equipment maker, materials company, and software vendor that sells into both supply chains. The third interpretation concerns the projection embedded in the rule's existence. The original Foreign Direct Product Rule was premised on the pervasiveness of American content in global semiconductor supply. The premise was demonstrably true in 2020, which is why the rule had immediate reach. China's equivalent rule carries an implicit claim that Chinese content is, or soon will be, equally pervasive in enough of the global supply chain to give the rule comparable reach. That claim is a projection, not yet a measured reality. Chinese origin content in the most advanced chip manufacturing steps remains a fraction of American origin content by most estimates, but the act of projecting the claim through a legal instrument shapes supplier behavior before the underlying fact is confirmed. Companies begin calculating Chinese content exposure before enforcement arrives because the compliance cost of being wrong is too high to wait for the first case. The rule's existence is doing work that its enforcement record does not yet justify. That asymmetry between legal architecture and demonstrated enforcement power is the most important caveat on the second reading. The architecture is confirmed. The enforcement reach is a projection. The metric moved from 1 to 2 in fewer than 4 years. The speed carries its own reading. In earlier eras of technology statecraft, the time between a major power deploying a novel control instrument and a rival deploying an equivalent ran in decades. The Foreign Direct Product Rule was expanded against a major Chinese company in May 2020. Structurally equivalent Chinese controls were being published and enforced by 2023 and 2024. The policy cycle compressed from decades to years. That compression means the window of asymmetric advantage for any novel control instrument is shorter than the instrument's designers may have assumed when they calibrated it. What the United States built as a permanent asymmetric advantage in semiconductor statecraft became a transferable design in the time it took to litigate the first compliance cases. The 0.1% threshold was the sharpest edge of American semiconductor export control. That edge is now shared. The control architecture did not hold the jurisdictional count at 1. It transferred the tool to the party it was aimed at, through the same public documentation that made the tool enforceable in the first place. 1 jurisdiction in May 2020. 2 by 2024. When the instrument proliferates, the advantage it was designed to protect does not. The next reading is due by the close of 2026. The question is whether a third jurisdiction, the European Union operating under its foreign subsidies regulation framework, or a Southeast Asian manufacturing state under simultaneous pressure from both existing jurisdictions, codifies its own content threshold extraterritorial rule. If it does, the metric moves to 3 and the bilateral standoff becomes a standard that any sufficiently large market can adopt. A bilateral structure is bounded and in theory negotiable. A multipolar structure with 3 or more sovereigns running conflicting extraterritorial content rules is a different architecture entirely, and no single power can coordinate it back to 1. If that third reading matters to you, subscribe and turn on notifications. That is where this channel takes the next measurement.